The desert wind carried the scent of lavender and gunpowder as Jesse Coulter stepped onto the porch of the abandoned ranch, straight into the barrel of a Winchester. Behind the rifle stood a woman who burned hotter than the Arizona sun. Eliza McAllister. Sweat glistened between her breasts where her cotton shirt gaped open from running. The way her hips cocked against the rifle stock made Jesse's throat go dry. Last man who came here uninvited, she breathed, finger teasing the trigger. We buried him in the vegetable patch. Behind her, two more figures emerged from the shadows, younger but no less deadly. May, the redhead, licked her lips as she thumbed back her Colt's hammer. Annie, the blonde, pressed a knife against her thigh where Jesse couldn't help but notice how her skirt clung to damp skin. The deed in Jesse's hand suddenly felt heavier than a gold bar. The bank swore this land was empty. But these women? Christ alive. They smelled like living, breathing trouble. Lavender soap and gun oil, and something darker underneath. Eliza took a step forward. The setting sun turned her sweat-damp collar translucent. Jesse could count every rapid breath lifting her chest. You smell that, cowboy, May purred, circling behind him. That's 3 choices. Her pistol barrel traced his spine down to his belt. Lead, lust, or leave. Annie's knife flashed as she cut the deed from his grip. But if you stay... Her pink tongue caught the paper's edge. You'll need better papers. The Winchester's muzzle drifted lower, past Jesse's belt buckle. Eliza's green eyes promised violence or pleasure, maybe both. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Jesse swallowed hard. What happens when a man finds heaven? And hell's already living there. Let us know in the comments, what would you do in Jesse's boots? Don't forget to subscribe for more tales where danger collide under the western sun. Your support keeps these stories coming. The McAllister ranch creaked under the weight of silence, broken only by the faint drip of a bucket in the corner. Jesse stood rooted, the forged deed now in Annie's hands, her fingers tracing its edges like a lover's skin. Eliza lowered her Winchester, but her eyes stayed sharp, cutting through him like a blade through leather. May leaned against the doorframe, her Colt still drawn, her lips curling into a half-smile that promised trouble. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of lavender soap and the tang of gun oil, a mix that set Jesse's nerves alight. You're no banker, Eliza said, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. She stepped closer, her boots scuffing the worn floorboards. The lantern light caught the curve of her jaw, the damp strands of hair clinging to her neck. Jesse's gaze flickered to the open collar of her blouse, where a pulse beat fast under her skin. He forced his eyes up, meeting hers. I'm just a man with a deed, he said, his voice rougher than he meant. Bank sent me to claim what's owed. May snorted, her red hair glinting as she tossed her head. Owed? She moved behind him, her breath warm against his ear as she leaned in, her body brushing his shoulder. That land's soaked in our blood, cowboy. You think paper changes that? Her fingers grazed his arm, light but deliberate, sending a jolt through him. He stiffened, his hands curling into fists to keep from reaching out. Annie sat at the table, the deed spread before her. Her blonde braids swung as she tilted her head, studying the paper with a frown. This seal's wrong, she murmured, her voice soft but certain. Her skirt shifted as she leaned forward, revealing a glimpse of her thigh, pale and smooth. Jesse's mouth went dry, but he caught the glint in her eye. Sharp, calculating, not the innocent girl she played. Someone's lying, she added, glancing at Eliza. Eliza's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else. Grief, maybe, or fear. Our father died for this land, she said, her voice low, like a prayer. Shot down by men who wanted it cheap? You one of them, Coulter? She stepped closer, so close he could smell the lavender on her skin, feel the heat radiating from her. His heart thudded, a traitor to his calm. He wanted to tell her no, that he was just a drifter, a man running from his own ghosts, but the weight of her stare, the way her chest rose with each breath, kept him silent. I ain't your enemy, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But I ain't your friend, neither. He stepped back, needing distance from her fire, from the way May's eyes danced with mischief, from Annie's quiet intensity. The room felt too small, the walls closing in like a trap. May laughed, a low, throaty sound that stirred something deep in Jessie's gut. She holstered her Colt, her fingers lingering on the grip, her hips swaying as she crossed the room to stand by Eliza. He's got secrets, she said, her voice teasing but sharp. Look at him, Liza. Man's running from something worse than us. Jessie's jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong. The war had left him hollow, his family gone to ash in a raid he couldn't stop. This ranch was supposed to be his redemption, a place to start clean. But these women, their fire, their pain, were pulling him into something deeper, something he wasn't sure he could escape. Eliza turned away, her shoulders tense, and picked up a silver locket from the table. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a faded daguerreotype of a man. Her father, Jessie guessed. You stay tonight, she said, not looking at him. But come morning, you prove that deed, or you're gone. Her voice cracked, just enough to betray the weight she carried. Jessie nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to reach for her, to ease the ache in her eyes, but he stayed still. The room fell quiet, save for the wind outside, rattling the windows like a warning. He was a stranger here, caught between duty and desire, and the night stretched out like a noose. The moon hung low, casting a silver sheen over the McAllister ranch, but the air crackled with unease. Jessie sat by the barn, sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape a poor shield against the storm brewing inside him. Eliza's words echoed in his head, prove that deed, or you're gone. But it was her eyes, fierce and wounded, that kept him restless. May's teasing laugh, Annie's quiet scrutiny. They all pulled at him, threads of a noose he hadn't seen coming. Inside the house, Eliza stood at the window, her silhouette framed by the lantern's glow. She adjusted her blouse, the fabric pulling tight across her chest as she moved, unaware of Jessie's gaze from the shadows. Her fingers lingered on the silver locket, her breath hitching as memories of her father's blood-soaked shirt flooded back. She didn't trust Jessie, not yet, but the way his voice softened when he spoke of loss had cracked something in her armor. A horse's whinny shattered the quiet. Jessie's knife stilled, his eyes narrowing as hooves thundered in the distance. May burst from the house, her red hair loose, her revolver already drawn. "Riders," she hissed, her body tense, the curve of her hips stark against the moonlight. Annie followed, her skirt swaying as she loaded a rifle with practiced ease, her delicate fingers belying her resolve. Eliza stepped onto the porch, her Winchester in hand, her gaze locking with Jessie's. "You with us, Coulter? Or them?" she asked, her voice low, each word a test. He stood, his jaw tight, the knife slipping into his boot. "I ain't running," he said, grabbing his revolver from the saddlebag. Her eyes flickered, a spark of something. Trust, maybe, or something hotter, before she turned away. The riders crested the hill, 5 men led by Jed Collins, the bank's enforcer. His grin was a snake's, his voice oily as he called out, "Time's up, ladies. Hand over the land or we burn it." May spat in the dirt, her finger itching on the trigger. Annie's grip tightened on her rifle, her breath quickening, a flush rising on her neck. Jessie stepped forward, his voice steady. "You're on McAllister land. Leave, or you'll be carried out." Collins laughed, but his eyes narrowed, catching the steel in Jesse's stance. The air grew taut, a wire ready to snap. Then, a glint of metal. Collins's men drew, and hell broke loose. Bullets tore through the night, splintering the barn. May dove behind a water trough, her shots precise, her body low, the curve of her back catching the moonlight. Annie fired from the porch, her braids swinging, a bead of sweat tracing the hollow of her throat. Eliza stood her ground, her Winchester barking, her face fierce but pale, haunted by the night her father fell. Jesse tackled Eliza behind a barrel as a bullet grazed her arm, her gasp sharp against his ear. Her body pressed against his, warm and trembling, her breath hot on his neck. "Stay down," he growled, but her hand gripped his shirt, her nails digging into his chest. "I don't hide," she whispered, her lips so close he could taste her defiance. His pulse roared, the urge to pull her closer, warring with the gunfire around them. He pushed her back, firing over the barrel, dropping one of Collins's men. The fight slowed, the riders retreating, but not before Collins tossed a volley into the dirt. "Proof your land's ours," he sneered, wheeling his horse. May snatched it, her fingers shaking as she pulled out papers, more forged deeds, but one bore a name. Kessler. Eliza froze, her hand flying to her locket. "Kessler," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The man who killed my father." Jesse's blood went cold. He'd heard of Kessler, a shadow behind the bank, his ringed hand stained with blood. Annie's eyes widened, her rifle lowering. "That ring," she said, her voice barely audible. "I saw it on the deed's seal." She pulled the forged deed from her pocket, and there it was, a faint imprint of a family crest, Kessler's mark. Eliza turned to Jesse, her eyes blazing with betrayal. "You knew, didn't you?" she accused, her voice raw. "You're one of his dogs." Jesse's heart sank, the truth twisted by her pain. "I didn't," he said, but her glare cut deeper than any bullet. May stepped between them, her revolver half raised. "Prove it, cowboy," she said, her voice cold. "Or you're next." The volley lay open in the dirt, papers fluttering in the wind, a noose tightening around them all. What had Jesse walked into? And could he outrun the shadow of Kessler's name? Dawn broke over the McAllister ranch, painting the sky blood red, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Jesse hadn't slept, his back against the barn, his revolver cold in his hand. Eliza's accusation, "You're one of his dogs," cut deeper than he'd admit, her eyes branding him with distrust. May's cold challenge lingered, and Annie's quiet stare, like she saw through his soul, kept him on edge. The volley of forged deeds lay inside. Kessler's name, a poison spreading through them all. Eliza emerged from the house, her arm bandaged from the graze, her blouse tucked tight, accentuating the curve of her waist as she carried a bucket of water. She paused, catching Jesse's gaze, her lips parting as if to speak, but pride held her back. The way her hips swayed, unyielding yet vulnerable, stirred a hunger in him he fought to bury. May followed, her red hair tied back, her revolver holstered low on her thigh, the leather strap framing her form. "No time for staring, cowboy," she said, her voice sharp but teasing, her eyes daring him to cross a line. Annie, ever the shadow, slipped out last, her skirt brushing her knees as she knelt to check the rifle stash. A bead of sweat rolled down her neck, catching the morning light, and Jesse's throat tightened, his resolve fraying under their collective fire. But the hoofbeats in the distance snapped him back. Kessler was coming, and he wasn't alone. "They're here," Eliza said, her voice steady but tight, her Winchester already in hand. She glanced at Jesse, her eyes searching for truth. Last chance, Coulter. Whose side you on? He met her gaze, his voice low. Yours. Always was. Her breath hitched, a flicker of belief softening her face, but the moment shattered as dust rose on the horizon. Kessler rode into view, his black hat low, his ring glinting like a curse. A dozen men flanked him, their rifles gleaming. You should have run, he called, his voice smooth as venom. This land's mine now. Eliza stepped forward, her chin high, her body taut. You killed my father, she said, each word a blade. You'll die before you take this. The air exploded with gunfire. Jessie dove for cover, pulling Annie behind a wagon as bullets splintered the wood. Her body pressed against his, her breath rapid, her hands clutching his arm. Don't let them win, she whispered, her voice fierce, her warmth a dangerous distraction. He nodded, firing back, his shots precise, born of years in the war's shadow. May weaved through the chaos, her revolver barking, her movements fluid, the curve of her back stark as she ducked behind a trough. A bullet grazed her thigh, blood blooming on her skirt, but she gritted her teeth, firing again. Not today, she growled, her defiance a fire that burned brighter than her pain. Eliza fought like a storm, her Winchester steady, but Kessler's men closed in. Jessie saw her falter, a man aiming at her back. He sprinted, tackling her into the dirt, their bodies tangled, her breath hot against his cheek. Her nails dug into his shoulders, her eyes wide, not with fear but with something raw, unspoken. I told you. I don't hide, she panted, her lips inches from his. His hand slid to her waist, steadying her, the heat of her skin searing through her blouse. For a moment, the world was just them. Her heartbeat, his restraint crumbling. The almost of their touch, a fire he couldn't quench. A bullet whizzed past, and he pulled her up, shoving her behind a crate. Kessler laughed, his voice cutting through the gunfire. You can't save them, Coulter. He tossed a torch, flames licking the grain shed, smoke choking the air. Annie screamed, trapped near the blaze, her skirt catching embers. Jessie ran, his heart pounding, and yanked her free, her body collapsing against his, her hands clutching his shirt. I got you, he said, his voice rough, her trembling form igniting a protectiveness he hadn't felt since the war. May fired her last shot, dropping a man, but her leg buckled. Eliza reached her, dragging her to cover, their faces streaked with soot, their bond unbreakable. Jessie faced Kessler, his revolver raised, but Annie's cry stopped him cold. She held up Kessler's ring, stolen in the chaos, its crest gleaming. This proves it, she said, her voice shaking. You killed their father. Kessler's smile vanished, his men hesitating. Eliza's eyes locked on the ring, her hand trembling as she raised her rifle. You're done, she said, her voice a vow. But Kessler's hand twitched toward his gun, and the world held its breath. Would Eliza pull the trigger, or would Kessler's shadow claim them all? The smoke cleared, leaving the McAllister ranch scarred, but standing, the grain shed a smoldering ruin. Kessler's ring glinted in Annie's hand, a silent accusation that froze his men. Eliza's rifle trembled, her eyes locked on the man who'd stolen her father, her home, her peace. Her breath came fast, her chest rising under her torn blouse, the firelight tracing the curve of her collarbone. Jessie stood beside her, his revolver steady, his heart pounding with the weight of her pain. May, leaning on Eliza, her thigh bandaged, glared at Kessler with a fire that could burn the desert down. Annie stepped forward, her skirt singed, her voice cutting through the silence. You're done, Kessler. This proves everything. Kessler's smirk faltered, his hand hovering over his gun. You think a ring ends me? He sneered, but the townsfolk, drawn by the gunfire, closed in, their faces hard. Sheriff Davidson pushed through, his badge glinting. He took the ring, studied the forged deeds, and nodded. "You're under arrest, Kessler." The cuffs clicked, a sound sweeter than any hymn. Kessler's men scattered, their loyalty crumbling like dry earth. Eliza lowered her rifle, her shoulders sagging, the weight of years lifting. Jesse watched her, his chest tight. He'd come for a deed, a fresh start, but found something heavier, a debt to these women, to their fight. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I don't want the bank's money," he said. "I want a place to call home." Her eyes met his, softened by the dusk, a flicker of trust breaking through her walls. The sun dipped low, painting the ranch in gold. Eliza stood by the fence, her fingers tracing the locket, her silhouette a promise of strength reborn. Jesse joined her, their shoulders brushing, the space between them alive with unspoken possibility. "Stay," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "But don't break my fence." He chuckled, the sound raw, real. May tossed an apple his way, her grin sly. "You're still in our debt, cowboy." A letter from Chicago lay unopened on the table, hinting at a larger shadow behind Kessler. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the land was theirs. The horizon stretched wide, a road to redemption, lit by the last light of day. If this tale moved you, drop a like, tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe for more. A super thanks keeps these stories alive, carrying us down the dusty trails ahead.